them continually, and from all these evils they saw no way to escape. For the men in power and legislation were the men whose interest it was to oppress and make gain of the laborer. End quote. So, once again, you know, we're really hitting on a lot of the things that are still issues to this day. In that county in the 1760s, the regulators organized to prevent the collection of taxes or the confiscation of the property of tax delinquents. Officials said, quote, an absolute insurrection of a dangerous tendency has broke out in Orange County, end quote, and made military plans to suppress it. At one point, 700 armed farmers forced the release of 2 arrested regulator leaders. The regulators petitioned the government on their grievances in 1768, citing, quote, the unequal chances the poor and the weak have in contentions with the rich and the powerful, end quote. In another county, Anson, a local militia colonel complained of, quote, the unparalleled tumults, insurrections, and commotions which at present distract this county, end quote. At one point, 100 men broke up the proceedings at a county court, but they also tried to elect farmers to the assembly, asserting that a majority of our assembly is composed of lawyers, clerks, and others in connection with them, end quote. In 1770, there was a large-scale riot in Hillsborough, North Carolina, in which they disrupted a court, forced the judge to flee, beat 3 lawyers and 2 merchants, and looted stores. The result of all this was that the Assembly passed some moral reform legislation, but also an act, quote, to prevent riots and tumults, end quote, and the governor prepared to crush them militarily. In May of 1771, there was a decisive battle in which several thousand regulators were defeated by a disciplined army using cannon. 6 regulators were hanged. Hay says that in the 3 western counties of Orange, Anson, and Rowan, where the regulator movement was concentrated, it had the support of 6,000 to 7,000 men out of a total white taxable population of about 8,000. So, out of 8,000 people, 6,000 to 7,000 were very mad, and only 1,000 were not a part of it. Guess who I bet you those 1,000 belong to? One consequence of this bitter conflict is that only a minority of the people in the regulator counties seem to have participated as patriots in the Revolutionary War. Most of them probably remained neutral. Fortunately for the revolutionary movement, the key battles were being fought in the north, and here in the cities, the colonial leaders had a divided white population. They could win over the mechanics, who were kind of middle class, who had a stake in the fight against England, who faced competition from English manufacturers. The biggest problem was to keep the propertyless people who were unemployed and hungry in the crisis following the French War under control. In Boston, the economic grievances of the lower classes mingled with anger against the British and exploded into mob violence. The leaders of the independence movement wanted to use that mob energy against England, but also to contain it so it wouldn't demand too much from them. When riots against the Stamp Act swept Boston in 1767, they were analyzed by the commander of the British forces in North America, General Thomas Gage, as follows. Quote, the Boston mob, raised first by the instigation of many of the principal inhabitants, allured by plunder, rose shortly after of their own accord, attacked, robbed, and destroyed several houses, and amongst others that of the lieutenant governor. People then began to be terrified at the spirit they had raised, to perceive the popular fury was not to be guided, and each individual feared he might be the next victim to their rapacity. The same fear spread through the other provinces, and there has been as much pains taken since to prevent insurrections of the people as before to excite them. End quote. Gage's comments suggest that leaders of the movement against the Stamp Act had instigated crowd action, but then became frightened by the thought that it might be directed against their wealth too. At this time, the top 10% of Boston's taxpayers held about 66% of Boston's taxable wealth, while the lowest 30% of the taxpaying population had no taxable property at all. The propertyless could not vote, and so, like blacks, women, and Indians, could not participate in town meetings. This included sailors, journeymen, apprentices, and servants. Dick Horder, a student of Boston mob actions in the Revolutionary period, calls the revolutionary leadership, quote, the Sons of Liberty type drawn from the milling interest and well-to-do merchants, a hesitant leadership, end quote, wanting to spur action against Great Britain, yet worrying about maintaining control over the crowds at home. It took the Stamp Act crisis to make this leadership aware of its dilemma. A political group in Boston called the Loyal Nine merchants, distillers, ship owners, and master craftsmen who opposed the Stamp Act, organized a procession in August 1765 to protest it. They put 50 master craftsmen at the head, but needed to mobilize ship workers from the north end and mechanics and apprentices from the south end. 2 or 3 thousand were in the procession, Negroes were excluded, and they marched to the home of the stamp master and burned his effigy. But after the gentlemen who organized the demonstration left, the crowd went further and destroyed some of the stamp master's property. These were, as one of the Loyal Nine said, amazingly inflamed people. The Loyal Nine seemed taken aback by the direct assault on the wealthy furnishings of the stamp master. The rich set up armed patrols. Now a town meeting was called, and the same leaders who had planned the demonstration denounced the violence and disavowed the actions of the crowd. As more demonstrations were planned for November 1st of 1765, when the Stamp Act was to go into effect, and for Pope's Day, November 5th, Pope's Day is November 5th, which is very interesting because I don't know if the 5th of November was done by this time in England. So I'm very curious the years on that. Let me see if I can look that up here real quick. So 1765 it says. Let's see, Guy Fawkes. Okay, yeah, no, the failed gunpowder plot was in 1605. So absolutely, that was 160 years earlier. That definitely was, Guy Fawkes Day definitely existed by then because it was 1605. So 160 years later, they're calling November 5th Pope's Day. Very interesting. I'm checking the chat here. Thinking about how taxing rich people doesn't work because it requires us to still be dependent on the idea that rich people still exist. It still gives them power over us because they'll always try and fight to get their wealth back. Basically, get rid of the concept of rich people. Exactly. And the fact that we're looking at stuff from 250 years ago, it's already pretty intense that somebody like Emma Goldman was writing about this stuff 100 years ago plus. But we're talking over 250 years ago, and the actual things that the actual people were actually protesting are the same things that are being protested against now. And once again, rich people back then were still doing the same tactics that the rich people are doing now, mainly decrying the people trying to level the playing field, decrying their actions, and how dare they do things like get all out of control and try to even the playing field. How funny, how funny. And also how funny that Pope's Day was November 5th, 160 years later, when we already know Guy Fawkes existed. Granted, at this particular point in time, they're not very keen on the English, but, you know, it's just fascinating the days that are being heralded as opposed to the ones that are actually important in it. So, as more demonstrations were planned for November 1st of 1765 when the Stamp Act was to go into effect, and for Pope's Day on November 5th, steps were taken to keep things under control. A dinner was given for certain leaders of the rioters to win them over, and when the Stamp Act was repealed, due to overwhelming resistance, the conservative leaders severed their connections with the rioters. They held annual celebrations of the first anti-Stamp Act demonstration, to which they invited, according to Horder, not the rioters, but, quote, mainly upper and middle-class Bostonians who traveled in coaches and carriages to Roxbury or Dorchester for opulent feasts, end quote.